Welcome back to another episode of One Door at a Time, Concentric Educational Solutions podcast, where we have the intersection of politics, business, community, and just having a great conversation with great guests. As you saw, we're in season 4 now, and it's really about business people, entrepreneurs, people who are paving the way, who are taking those risks. And this is a very timely conversation. My guest today, we'll really talk about redemption, talk about your new book, which is going to be huge. I'm manifesting it now. It's going to be a bestseller. I need everybody to go copy it. It's going to be on pre-sale soon. But I always want to thank my sponsors, Mercedes-Benz of Catonsville. Thank you for keeping me clean, Sam, and that S580. Appreciate it. And Atlas Restaurant Group, you can catch them. 34, 35 locations all around Maryland. They're in Houston and in Philadelphia. But without further ado, my guest today is going to be, as I mentioned, best-selling author from native Baltimorean, Kevin Shird.
Be More.
Be More has a new book coming out in April? It's dropping?
April 1st, 2025.
Okay, you can cop it, but let's get right into it. So You're from Baltimore. You have a very unique story. I feel like I've known you for years now, but it's only been a couple months, but be able to bond and really talk about a shared struggle, a shared experience.
Absolutely.
So tell me about just you growing up in early Baltimore and what that meant to you.
I don't know, man. Just a regular kid growing up in West Baltimore, sports, basketball, baseball, football.
Okay.
But then you get off track at some point, right?
Yeah.
And so as a teenager, I got into the drug game in Baltimore at 16 years old. And ended up in that world, and it just became a whirlwind of just not only bad decisions, but just traumatic things happening along the way, right?
Okay. So when you're thinking about West Baltimore, give kind of context, proximity. Is it more like Park Heights area, EV? Where are we talking about? Like,
so I grew up initially I grew up in the Emerson Village area.
Okay.
And then some years later, we ended up moving with my grandmother around the Pulaski, Baltimore Street area.
Yep.
So I kind of grew up in that space as well. Mm-hmm. We had fun at times, and it's crazy looking back now and writing about these things. Mm-hmm. The danger we put ourselves in back in those days, and we didn't realize it was danger. Mm-hmm. It was just, for us, it was just an urban environment that we grew up in, and it was home, right? So nowadays, just writing, I write often about those stories from that perspective. What did that world look like for me, 20, 30 years ago, right?
Around what years were you growing up? Like your formative years in Baltimore?
Well, as a young kid, late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s,
wow,
that kind of stuff. By 23 years old, man, I was making $20,000 a day selling heroin on Mountain Fair Street in West Baltimore. The same neighborhoods that David Simon wrote about in his first, one of his books, The Corner.
Yeah, The Corner, yes, yeah.
So even some characters that were actually in The Corner actually used to work for me on the streets, right?
Okay. It used to be on HBO, yeah.
And a lot of times I'm reluctant to talk about that kind of stuff because I go to a lot of schools and talk to kids, right?
Yeah.
And I can honestly say I made $1 million in the street, right?
Wow.
I never want to give a young kid the impression that that's cool, right? Or that's the way to travel, right? So I'm always cautious about how I talk about those things. Of course, I've written about it, right? But I never want a kid to think like, oh, I want to be like that guy.
Absolutely.
No, I want you to be like the guy I meet today, the writer, the advocate, the activist, but not the guy I was, 20-some years ago. You know what I mean?
What are some of the early events in your life that kind of shaped who you were or who you are now?
You know what? So I told you we played sports growing up, right?
Yep.
So I was a tall kid growing up, and I had a buddy that was actually taller than me growing up, around 16 years old. And we used to sneak into this club up in Park Heights, right? Had no business being there. That's what I'm saying about doing stuff and literally putting yourself in danger and not even realizing you're putting yourself in danger. So it was a club in Park Heights, and we used to sneak into the club, and it was dealers from all over the city. It was a popular place at that time. And, rap music was still emerging, right?
Yep.
We just wanted to hear rap music, dance, and have fun. We had no business being out the house, at 16 years old, at 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, I feel you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was, but one night we was in the club, and we had snuck in this club maybe about 6 or 7 times. And I actually think at around the 6th or 7th, the bouncers knew, just go ahead, right?
Yeah, yep.
And we got in the club and we listening to music, and the shot rings out in the dark, right? And everybody hits the floor, but then the stampede starts. So we get caught up, me and my buddy, he grabs me, and we get caught up in the stampede, and people are running this way. And then that stampede reverses and people start running this way, right? And then we end up running past the dead body.
Oh, wow.
It was shot, right?
Okay.
And I never connected the dots between like that incident and kind of me years later, because from that point on, I never liked fireworks.
Okay.
I was always bothered by the sound of fireworks, right? I never really liked clubs. So I was bothered by, I never really liked clubs, and I never really understood how that incident impacted me. So even writing this new book today about being re-traumatized and unresolved trauma, that was actually that case. That was basically unresolved trauma that I never had addressed, and it stuck with me for years. Matter of fact, for decades, right? Because even hearing 4th of July fireworks,
it will set you off a little bit.
I just never enjoyed it, right? And never understood why, right? 19 years old, I think we were at Drewville Park, broad daylight. So Sundays used to be a big deal in Drewville Park in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Bring out the nice cars, the guys come out with the nice motorcycles. It was just part of the culture of Baltimore. But I never forget, a dispute erupted between 2 guys, and it was crazy, man. There's about 100 people out in the park that day. And you can see the guy chasing the guy across the lawn. And then the guy that he was chasing, he just stopped for some reason. He was tired, I don't know. And the guy put the gun to his head, shot him in the head in broad daylight in front of 100 people in the park.
Wow.
That's the second violence that I had witnessed, right? Not realizing this stuff ain't normal.
Yeah.
It's normal when you're in those environments, right? And again, you talk about mental health, trauma, unresolved trauma. So you find yourself in this cycle of just seeing traumatic events all constantly.
And we normalize it.
And we've normalized. Because we didn't even blink after that. We didn't even blink, right? And then getting into the drug business in Baltimore, and being shot at and being in violent situations. We normalize that stuff, and I think a part of it, you almost have to normalize it to remain in that environment. Because if you feel afraid or scared, you probably will back away from that environment. So it's a part of you, it may be peer pressure, whatever, that wants you to stay in that space, right? But that's for the human being. The reaction really is to pull back from things, from danger, right? Yeah. But again, like you said, we normalized it.
So obviously you got jammed up.
Yeah.
Right. I think a important part of the story is one of the things that we connected with is having spent time. You much more significantly than I did, but particularly at an early age, it does something to you, right? Like it's a continuation of what's normal and what's normalized and how to adapt. Like, how does some of that stuff shape you into how you were able to now look back and kind of take that journey? Whether it was an emotional journey, mental health journey to get you where now. Like, what are some of the things that you took away from your time?
So I think one of the things that really saved my life. So in total, I spent 12 years in prison, right? Federal prison, California state prison, but 12 years in total. Again, witnessing traumatic event after traumatic event after traumatic. But the thing that saved me was actually seeking an education.
While you were in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I took college courses while I was in prison.
Okay.
Right?
Yes. Man.
And
I got my GED while I was in there, my high school diploma.
And so through those moments, you gain the education, and that's one of the tools that you use to help you navigate those spaces, but also pull you out of those spaces, right?
Absolutely.
I remember, reading and writing about successful Black men, even successful Black women, that had used education as a tool to pull themselves up.
Is this what you were reading and writing while you were incarcerated? Or
definitely reading, not so much writing, but definitely reading. And ironically, I end up, you get in those spaces and you start, prison was the first time I met guys that couldn't read. So in my entire life, I might have came across a guy that couldn't read and didn't know it. But prison was the first time that I actually met grown men that couldn't read, because what ended up happening, I ended up getting a job in the education building in the prison.
Oh, wow.
So I ended up tutoring guys that were going after GEDs, or even the guys that were, Hispanic guys that didn't even understand the language. So a lot of these guys would get papers from the court, right? These guys would get letters from judges and from the court, and they couldn't even read the letters. Right, saying that they are eligible for reduction in sentences. So I ended up I found myself helping these guys write letters to the court, helping a lot of guys get back in the court, right? So between the reading, so that was my first real effort to really get into writing, right? And I never connected the dots. A police report is basically a narrative, right? I saw the guy at noon in a blue car, wearing a red shirt, going down North Avenue. The narrative. I never connected the dots between that and writing. So it's basically a story, right? So the officer is telling the story, or the prosecutor is telling the story, right? As the lawyer maybe defending another individual, your job is to dispute that story and tell another story. So you're also telling a narrative, right? So I started writing. That's where the writing began, right?
Is that where you really start feeling the inclination and the power of writing?
It's where I started to understand it better.
Okay.
And then later, it wasn't too much later that I actually started writing my own story. So I was released from prison in 2006 after a total of 12 years.
Wow.
Why?
That's not a long time ago. When in perspective, like 18 years, but
18 years. Yeah. 18
Wow.
years. But while I was in, I met a gentleman that ended up becoming my cellmate. And you know how we kind of throw that term around with guys we're familiar with. That's my crazy homeboy, right?
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't realize he really had a mental health issue. Right? I just started a guy from the neighborhood, from East Baltimore. That, was kind of wild, kind of a little overly aggressive sometimes, right? Never associated that with a mental health illness. So fast forward to 2006, I got released. 2008, I never forget it. I was home watching CNN. And I saw on CNN that the U.S. Army therapists from the U.S. Army was using writing to help soldiers that were coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq understand, write about their stories, the trauma and violence that they witnessed in Afghanistan and Iraq.
As a way of therapy for their PTSD?
Therapy for PTSD, yeah.
Wow.
And I never forget seeing that on CNN. I was like, damn. And at the time, I was trying to just navigate being back in, back in society.
Which is a traumatic experience.
It's a traumatic experience. You just can't, you can't always connect the dots between the trauma you experience and what you're feeling now.
Yeah.
Right? So seeing that piece on CNN, I was like, wow. And people would always tell me like, man, you had a crazy life. You need to write a story or write a book. And I was like, I don't want to write no book, man. I don't know if I could focus that long to write a book. And I started writing a book. And I came home from work one day and I said, I'm gonna try 20 pages and see what happens. I never forget, it was a Friday. And I said, I wrote the 20 pages and I said, wow, this is dope. Best 20 pages ever, right? And I had a friend who was an editor and I sent it to her, right? And she hit me back and she said, this is horrible. She said, but I know your story and I know you can do better than that, right? And she gave me some pointers. She said, look, I want to smell it, taste it, feel it, right? When I read your work. You talking about your grandmother's apple pie, I want to smell it when I read it, right? Yeah. You know, you talk about the violence in West Baltimore, I want to feel the violence in West Baltimore, right? Smell it, taste it, feel it. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. So I adopted that concept, right? And even if you go back to read my first book today, I still got a lot of that. Like people would say to me, man, I thought I was in the scene. Like I could feel I was inside the scene, right? All that came from getting pointers from my first, who turned out to be my editor, writing that book. My first time really realizing something was off was while I was writing that book. Because we have a tendency, you said it yourself, normalizing violence, normalizing exposure to trauma. So for years, you just push that stuff away because that's the only way you can move forward. You kind of try to push it to the side. And so while I was writing that book, I was writing about a scene where I was in a shootout in West Baltimore, and I totally forgot about all this, like the situation. He's talking years later, right? And it's just not something you walk around. It's something that's constantly on your mind. But it was a shootout, and while I was writing about it, it kind of hit me. Because I totally forgot all about it, right?
And doing that writing, you were pulling it out of you.
Man, not just that, the visual came back, and I can remember it was broad daylight, and I got into a shootout, and I could see in the visual, I could see backpacks of children, and it messed me up. It messed me up because now I remember. It was broad daylight on a busy street, and that's the stupidity and the bad decision making that we constantly see in those environments, right? And we don't see it until later when we turn on the news and you see a child was shot or a grandmother was shot, right? An innocent person, and I just started thinking about how an innocent person could have been killed that day for my poor choices that I made, right? And it really hit me hard. And so tears start coming out my eyes while I'm writing. I'm home by myself in the room alone, and tears start coming out my eyes. I was like, wow. And I'm talking 15 years later. So I spoke to a friend of mine who was working in mental health at the time, and I told her about the situation. And she said, you might have something called PTSD. What the hell is PTSD? And I started researching it, and I was like, wow. So a short time later, I ended up making an appointment to see a therapist. And then we started the first appointment wasn't so great, but finally I got settled in with a therapist I was comfortable with, and we started to unravel all of that stuff, all that baggage that you've been carrying around for years. and not really confronting, right?
So this has been a journey of yours.
It's been a journey. Yeah. It's exactly. So, because this book, I've been writing this book for 10 years.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about it, right? It is that because I think there's been this convergence of a lot of different circumstances. One in the world because of COVID, there become a much more brighter light on mental health.
Mental health.
Although I would argue there's still kind of a stigma in the African-American community about it, particularly with African-American men.
For sure.
You know, right around that time you were coming out, and when you came out 06, there was, in the DSM-5, they started talking about complex trauma, where it wasn't a singular incident, but it was a prolonged, where you're just exposed to trauma over and over, right? Growing up in your neighborhoods, you know, in the environment. So talk about this journey now. So you put your book out. It's been a decade now writing this one. That's what I'm about. Like, talk through what this book is really about. What the reader is going to gain from it, or what you hope the reader will gain from it.
Well, they'll gain a better understanding of trauma, unresolved trauma, PTSD, complex trauma, through storytelling, right? Through my story of many of the things that I just mentioned, having trouble sleeping at night, kind of reliving a lot of these moments unexpectedly, but also my former cellmate.
Yes,
because I mentioned that while I was in, I kind of became like a tutor, kind of to a lot of guys. Kind of wanted to be a positive force, even though I needed a positive force, right? Because I'm in the same jungle that they're living in. So I would try to get him to come up to the education building and check out books and, you know, stay away from negativity in the joint. And I thought he got it together. We got separated in 2004, I believe it was. And I ended up getting transferred to another federal prison to take a program. And so a college program. And he stayed there and he got released. And I never heard from him again.
Why?
In 2009, while I was writing my first book, I couldn't remember his real name. We used to call him Soul in the joint. So I had no way of checking up on him or finding. Then one day, I remembered his name, Damian Neal. So I Googled him, and this big article popped up that he committed a double murder in Delaware. And it was mind-blowing, man, because, and I couldn't wrap my arms around the whole situation. And I think when you come out of any space where men just spend a lot of time together, you start to build some kind of camaraderie.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you want everybody to succeed.
Yeah.
Right? And so seeing that he committed this murder, I knew what double murder, I knew what that meant.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's over.
Yeah.
Life is over. So, and I could not wrap my arms around the whole situation. And then later on, I ended up talking. I spent years researching the case. I would order paperwork from the court clerk up in Delaware. I ended up getting the police report. I ended up getting the autopsy. I ended up getting all this stuff because I wanted to really understand what happened. Mind you, this is in the course of me writing 3 other books.
Wow, okay.
So through that course, I learned how to be a researcher, right? I learned how to research. I learned how to get documentation, corroborate stuff, information. And so by that time, and so after a couple years, I think I was on my 3rd book at the time, and I ended up interviewing the prosecutor that prosecuted the case.
Oh, okay, on him.
On him. Yeah, I was granted an interview under the auspice of being a journalist. And they gave me an interview for the case. And I even learned more because that's when I really found out, it started to connect the dots. Because it was a capital murder, the judge had to order a mental health evaluation and assessment from 3 psychiatrists. So later on, I was able to get my hands on the mental health evaluation and assessment from the 3 psychiatrists, and I saw, man, he was dealing with some major stuff.
Were the commonalities across all 3?
Yes.
Okay.
Although Delaware has a law called extreme emotional distress.
Okay.
So in the case of a murder, it's almost like an insanity plea, where in the case of a murder, the murder can be dropped to a manslaughter if you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was extreme emotional distress. Almost like an
From history? Like
history and the moment.
in the moment, okay.
And so 2 doctors said he suffered from extreme emotional distress. One said he didn't.
Okay.
Right? You had the 2. So, but when he was dealing with really deep, even deeper mental health issues. So he basically told the lawyers he didn't want to pursue that type of defense. And he took which would have got him probably 30 years.
Okay.
He took a plea to life plus 35 years.
What do you think, what was the motivation not wanting to take that defense?
Mental health issues, yeah, paranoia. A lot of the stuff he was diagnosed with was showing up in his dealings with his attorney.
Okay.
Right? And so there really was no rational reason, and I think he took the most irrational choice was to take a plea to life plus 35 years. So that kind of reinforced everything that was going on with him.
So from this case, what are some of the things that, you really learned about mental health illness and, just in general, but then specifically for African-American men?
We got to alleviate the stigma around mental health. We got to get away from that because that's stuck now growth.
Yeah. Right.
I was having a conversation with a friend a while back about diversity, equity, inclusion, which is great. But if we move our people into great spaces and they're earning more income and life is better, but then we haven't addressed the mental health issues, they're probably not going to stay there.
Yeah.
We need people to sustain, right? So in my view, a lot of this stuff is connected.
Yeah.
And then a better understanding about trauma, man. You move on, a situation happened, you might move on from it for 20 years. And you may not realize it's been impacting your life for 20 years. Like I told you.
Absolutely.
It was literally 15, 20 years, I could not stand the sound of fireworks. And never connected the dots between being, hearing a shooting or being involved in the shooting. And that's why you don't like fireworks, right?
Yep.
So now when your wife or girlfriend says, hey, I want to go see 4th of July fireworks, and you got all these excuses why you don't want to go, right? And you can't even really connect the dots yourself about why you're making the decisions you make because you've been traumatized and you never addressed it.
I was thinking about, I'm going on 49, and I'm thinking about all the crazy shit that I've experienced and shit that I've done and haven't moved on from. Regardless of whatever measure of success people may kind of attribute to what I've done. But I mean, it's there, right? Like, for me, so I have a co-diagnosis of substance abuse, alcoholism. A lot of people will take alcohol to numb. To me, it's to feel. It's to remember some of those feelings from the abandonment, from my parents passing away, grieving and stuff like that. I'm so numb throughout the day, being sober, that I want to remember and reconnect. But I'm 49 now. No one could have told me that, or I wouldn't have known in my 20s, right? Or just like all these things. So I mean, I think it's so powerful that you're able to bring these things to life through the power of storytelling, and using that real example. What would be some of the things that you would leave our listeners and your readers of the soon-to-be New York Times bestseller list, what would you leave them with?
Well, first, buy the book, A Life for Life.
Okay, where can we find it? Where can they find it?
Barnes and Nobles.
Okay.
Amazon, Simon and Schuster, Target.
See, that's when you know you kind of made it.
We go Target.
Yes.
We're gonna be all over the place, but hopefully we can start having normal conversations like this about mental health and trauma, right? I always say that if you wake up in the morning with a toothache, right, there's no hesitation of what your next step is going to be.
Nope. Yeah.
More often than not, it's a call to a dentist, right, to alleviate that pain, right? We got to normalize the same approach to mental health. Wake up in the morning not feeling well, make that call, right? We got to normalize that, man, because if not, we're going to be continually stuck in these places where we were. And there's no doubt in my mind that that journey of therapy, through writing up and also through counseling, right, helped me grow as a man and become a better father, a better friend, a better businessman, a better everything. Through that, and so just normalizing the conversation around mental health.
I want to ask you this last question. How did you decide on that title?
A Life for Life?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's crazy. It's actually in the book.
Okay.
It's a movie that I saw with Denzel Washington several years ago. The character was John Casey.
Okay.
And he was an assassin down in Mexico.
Okay.
Right. And he was chasing another assassin around, long story short. And the assassin's trying to kill him. He's trying to kill the guy. And he'd always speak in Mexican. He would say a term in Mexican. And then one day, Denzel asked him, like, what do you mean? What is that? What does that mean? What does that mean? And he said, a life for life. You take a life and you have to give a life in return. Your own, right? And I thought that was just so powerful and meaningful in this situation, because Damien took a life and now he had to give a life in return, which is his own, right? So that's where I got the title from. It's a powerful story. It's a story that we can learn a lot from. It's a story we can grow a lot from, man. But it's also an example of what not to do, right?
Absolutely.
Because a lot of times these simple disputes, we don't think much of, and then they explode, and now somebody lost their life, and now you're looking at the criminal justice system, right?
Yeah.
Small little disputes, how they explode. And so, you know, a lot of this is an example what not to do with respect to disputes. But also, again, just normalizing the conversation around mental health. How do we take those steps to normalize the conversation where people can get into a better space in their own life?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because I've witnessed so many people do it. And you raise a good point about COVID. Yeah. I think COVID peeled the scab back on that whole situation about how people's well-being, right? COVID exposed a lot of people that weren't doing well to begin with, but then COVID kind of tipped the scale, and now, you know, a lot of people had to look in the mirror and say, what do I do now? But it was great in the sense that the conversation started. You know what I mean? Because I think that's where it all begins. The conversation starts. Now, how do we move policy, right?
Absolutely. That's the next step. Yes.
To help people.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's where I wanna because what I also want to do is I want to get more licensed clinical social workers in prisons.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think if his issues would have been addressed while we were in prison, it's a possibility that when he got out, he possibly wouldn't have committed the crime that he committed, right? Against a girl that he was dating and her new boyfriend, right?
And to your point, you know, it's the early identification, the ongoing support, the awareness of it, the willingness to dig deep and kind of go through it. Brother, I look forward to it. You got to get it, everybody. Kevin Shird, A Life for a Life, April 1st.
April 1st, 2025.
2025, but you can go on all those places, Amazon, Target, Simon Schuster, get it early, pre-order it.
Pre-order, right?
Yeah,
now.
we got to get those numbers, get the awareness up. Good brother, ever since we just met, you've been extremely supportive, very understanding of my challenges, and just always pushing me. Continue to do the good work. Appreciate it so much. Thank you for stopping by, one door at a time. And we're making this transition. This will be the first time we mention it. We've been doing everything under Concentric Educational Solutions, which has been my platform and my baby for 16 years. But we're slowly trying to move it over to redemption and talking about that next step in life. And so look forward to explaining more of that and sharing more of that to all the audience. Until next time, you can catch all of our contact at concentric.world. Check it out. Want to say again, shout out to our esteemed sponsors, Mercedes-Benz of Catonsville, Atlas Restaurant Group, more to be coming. Until next time, I'm your host, David Heiber. See you soon.